We have charted our course across the seas of time to witness the dawn age of this Dungeons and Dragons world. We have witnessed the rise and fall of empires, and we have explored the ancient origins of primitive ritual magic. Now, as we close out these days of thunder, we continue our journey through history as we seek to unlock all the mysteries surrounding one of the most cataclysmic and controversial of events in the history of these forgotten realms. The Tearfall, the theories, the mythologies, the truth? Right now on Riches and Liches.
Welcome, adventurers, scholars, and world builders. I'm Rich, and this is Riches and Liches, dedicated to dungeons, dragons, and tales of lore. The Tearfall, a term etched in the historical record as one of the defining moments of the Forgotten Realms. Those two words alone denote a cataclysmic event that forever shaped Aearee. This event, occurring in the twilight of the age known as the Days of Thunder, is not merely an historical footnote, but a pivotal moment that ushered in a new age of profound transformation. A world-shaping event by all accounts, the Tearfall has been chronicled with varying degrees of interpretation, from surviving accounts of the creator races who were there, to the modern-day scholarly debates conducted within the lore-filled archives of Candlekeep. It is an epoch that saw the sundering of worlds, the rise and fall of entire civilizations, the dawn of dragonkind, and the remodeling of the realms, all setting the stage for the Forgotten Realms as we know them today. But it is around this event that the written historical accounts have become some of the most clouded and greatly divergent mythologies in all the Forgotten Realms lore, some of which seem to be wholly incompatible. And depending upon which ancient text you study or what cultural doctrine you follow, you will find that these conflicting written accounts are often slanted in favor of the dominant culture from which the mythology was originally sourced. So for the purposes of our exploration and discoveries in this volume, we will endeavor to look at every known theory, every strand of mythology, and of course all the lore regarding the Tearfall and its realm-shaping aftermath. The canonical, the retconned, and believe it or not, in some cases the canonical is the retconned. From elven myths and eldritch tales on the disaster itself to the fall of another creator race and the nascent rise of dragonkind. The sunset of these Days of Thunder was perhaps the most significant prehistoric millennia in all the Forgotten Realms. So, what was the Tearfall? How did it happen? And what were its, if you'll excuse the pun, impacts? Known by many names, the Seven turn winter, the Month of Mist, and Isle Eleste, or Falling Rain in Elven. The Tearfall is closely tied to, associated with, and sometimes even confused with, a distinctly separate but no less dramatic event, one that has only recently entered the lexicon of Forgotten Realms scholars, the Sundering. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. The Tearfall, according to the oldest written but vague accounts by the ancient Saruk, was a time marked with unimaginable planet-wide disasters, causing widespread death and a changing of the very landscape of the world that ultimately ended with what the Saruk recall in their writings as a, quote, changing of the stars, end quote. Contemporary accounts from the period describe the world immediately following the Tearfall as besieged by chaos and upheaval. The skies, once clear and predictable, became a veritable canvas of turmoil as stars shifted, constellations broke formation, and the night was illuminated by the fiery trails of celestial objects. While the various theories, dogmas, and mythologies surrounding the Tearfall event differ greatly on the true origins and their outcomes, all accounts agree on the event's suddenness and the overwhelming force with which it struck, leaving little time for many of the inhabitants of Aearee to react or even really comprehend the magnitude of the tragedy that was befalling them. The immediate physical effects of the Tearfall were catastrophic. The impact sites where the celestial bodies struck the planet became ground zeros for environmental upheaval. Forests flattened in moments, mountains crumbled instantly under the force, and rivers and seas diverted and reformed, creating an entirely new geography, a new landscape for the face of the planet. One of the most enduring markers of the Tearfall event, still visible to this day, was the formation of the Sea of Fallen Stars, the vast inland sea created by the reshaping and merging of 4 inner seas. This large body of water, now a defining feature of the continent of Faerun, serves as a visible record, a historical scar, if you will, giving permanent testimony to the power of the impacts that created it. But regardless of which historical or mythological account you follow, there is little doubt of the ravages and ruin it brought to the world, or the suffering and loss of life brought upon those that called its surface home. The Tearfall changed the face of the planet, and then came the Sundering. But we'll come back to that. First, let's examine the myriad of theories and beliefs surrounding this history-defining event. The genesis of the Tearfall, a subject of much scholarly and religious conjecture, is rooted in a myriad of disparate mythologies, each providing its own, well-aligned explanation for the event that reshaped Aearee Torel. As we begin to review each, it's important to note and consider that these origin writings, described by a diverse group of sources, are simply the mortal efforts to interpret a world-defining event through the lens of their own unique and, yes, sometimes convenient perspectives and beliefs. And it is here that I would offer a simple principle that I've come to call the mortal view of lore. A principle that I believe, if adhered to, will ensure that you not only enjoy the lore, but also the journey of its discovery, including the conflicts and retcons. This mortal view of lore is the mindset and understanding that we're not supposed to have all the knowledge, neatly organized and labeled. The lore is designed to have blind spots and gaps in places, to be obscure and vague, written with whatever bias, belief, or dogma that has influenced its authors. And yes, this is a convenient band-aid for what are truly publishing mistakes, bad decisions of game designers, and more often, game executives. But that's okay, because we get to choose the lore that populates our world, and it's my job to simply present it for your review. So conflicts and alternative histories abound. In short, it's supposed to be messy. That's why they're called mythologies and beliefs and theories, all intended to create mystery, vagueness, and a colorful palette from which to world build. The first mythology we will review is the Parwiccan cycle, an ancient compendium of elven myths and legends that depict the creation of dragons, those dragons' interactions with the elven races, and the accounting of significant events that shaped the early world, most notably for our discussion today, the Tearfall. In these writings, the Tearfall is depicted as not a singular, devastating moment, but a series of calamitous, prolonged events that shook the foundations of the world. According to the tales within the cycle, celestial bodies, taken to mean meteors or a rain of fire, descended upon the realm in an unprecedented scale, its onset as sudden as it was apocalyptic. From earth-splitting quakes to planet-wide floods and fire, a world-altering event. Described as harbingers of change, these writings take a very elven-like, poetic prose in their accounts, with each falling meteor often symbolized as tears of the gods, signifying a period of mourning and rebirth, a crucible from which new possibilities could emerge, reflecting the elves' perception of the events as a moment of both loss and creation. The elven texts go further to speculate on the nature of these celestial bodies that were descending upon the planet. Rather than inert rock, the meteors are proposed to have been the seeds of life, each carrying within it the potential for new beginnings. Central to this theory is the assertion that the meteors brought with them, or were in fact, dragon eggs, encapsulating the nascent forms that would become one of the most formidable of the realm's creatures. This conjecture ties with the origin of dragons, creatures intrinsically linked to the realm's magic and history, to the Tearfall itself, something we'll continue to explore when we cover the era known as the Time of Dragons. Until very recently, the almost romantic tales of loss written in the Parwiccan cycle were widely dismissed by most modern-day sages and scholars, in part due to the inherent revisionist history that stems from the fact that the elves were most likely not even present on Aearee Torel during the Tearfall event. However, in more modern times, with wisdom gained from the events of the Spellplague, aka 4th edition lore, the Parwiccan cycle has gained some credibility, seen now at least as something more than mere fanciful and fabricated tales. Although it should be noted, this recent credibility relates to the Parwiccan cycle writings that, depending upon your interpretation, may have cryptically predicted the return of the Dragonborn race upon the realms in 1359 Dale Reckoning, and not specific to our focus today, the Tearfall. Still, this has caused scholars, biased as they may be, to revisit those old elven fairy tales. Regardless, for those of elven heritage, the Parwiccan cycle is more than just a collection of mythological tales. It is a crucial part of elven cultural and historical identity, offering insights into their understanding of the world and their place within it. In studying the Parwiccan cycle, one gains insight into how the elves perceived and internalized the events we associate with the Tearfall. While its writings are light on actual observational data and more aligned with mythology and legends, the writings nonetheless create a coherent, if less than factual, narrative, likely designed primarily to be passed down through future elven generations. Thus, the Parwiccan cycle should still be considered both an historical document as well as a cultural artifact, reflecting the elves' reverence for the natural world and their desire to understand and rationalize the forces that sculpted the world around them. Our second theory on the Tearfall is rooted in the Draconic narrative as part of the Red Dragon creation myth. And I want to preface that this theory I present is a fusion from three variable sources: the ancient text written in the Book of the World mythology, the 1990 sourcebook Draconomicon, as well as a series of statements from Ed Greenwood himself. And I do this in an effort to piece together a cohesive view from the facets of lore that we do have, and at least attempt to present a narrative from the perspective of dragonkind, which I am clearly not. So until I get to interview a red dragon, this is the best I can do. With that said, compiled in the Draconic text and written from the eyes of dragonkind, these writings and lore represent a mythology and origin story that is intimately tied to the Tearfall. And it is in these Draconic accounts that we are presented with one of the many lore-bending versions of the dragon deity known as Asgaroth, the creator of all dragonkind. It should also be noted here, to avoid any confusion, that while I'm choosing to use the name Asgaroth for consistency, this entity is historically also referred to as Io, mostly from those that dwell in the outer planes, but they are one and the same and the names can be used interchangeably. However, Asgaroth is one of the more difficult figures to try and reconcile, as there simply are too many incompatible timelines and stories that are attributed to him, or her. Even the gender of this dragon, god, deity, primordial, finds debate depending upon what mythology you are studying. And it is here that we find good use for that principle, the mortal view of lore, that I offered at the beginning of Chapter 2. Regardless, according to this creation myth, as seen from the eyes of dragonkind, Asgaroth is a deity, and his role was that of the great catalyst for the Tearfall, as one might expect from a history of a dragon god written by dragons. The narrative begins with the existence of this prehistoric world, yet unmarked by the presence of any dragonkind. Yet this world, Aearee Torel, was the creation of Asgaroth, not Lord Ao, while the crystal sphere, or the sun depending upon your source, around which the planet revolved, was created by another creator god named Zotha. You will want to remember that name as it will come up a bit later. Zotha is described as a godlike being of immense power that resembled the form of a massive manta ray existing in the astral sea. In these draconic legends, Zotha was referred to as the Devourer, simply because he created life to play with and then consume at his whim with no regard to the sanctity of life. And it is here that the coming conflict is depicted. Zotha, as a threat to Asgaroth's world, descended upon the planet and forced Asgaroth to defend. The reasons for Zotha's descent from the heavens are murky at best, whether it was due to a conflict of some cosmic ideologies, a direct challenge to Asgaroth's authority, or simply because Zotha wanted to feed, are subjects of speculation among scholars and dragons alike. Nonetheless, Asgaroth at first attempted to shield the planet, but then was forced to engage in an epic cosmic battle for creation where the dragon deity Asgaroth, in victory, cast down the entity known as Xotha upon the planet. The mythology portrays this act as a direct cause of the Tearfall, and in its devastating plunge, Xotha was rendered into millions of raw fragments of his essence, raining upon the planet and causing a changing of the stars. This impact is the event that the Red Dragons attribute to their genesis. The Tearfall, a divine intervention that not only brought about their creation, but also established their place in the world's hierarchy. The myth goes on to describe some wholly unique and fascinating lore in the aftermath of this impact. Many of these fragments of Xotha fell beneath the planet into the vast, deep caverns that we now call the Underdark. And here, these fragments of sinister godlike essence formed the Illithids, the Neogi, and the Beholders of today. For scholars that study the Tearfall, the Red Dragon creation myth offers a window into draconic theology and, of course, their own worldview. While it too has its own canonical problems, are they really any worse than any of the other theories? As a human, I think I just have to openly admit my human bias, but it is interesting to be sure. Whether you give this theory any credibility or not, I leave up to you, but its study is still valuable as it allows for a deeper understanding and a window into how dragonkind perceive themselves and their origins, providing insight to their motivations and culture. The last of the primary Tearfall origin theories we will examine today is both the most recent, introduced in the 4th edition, the most controversial when you look at its underpinnings, and yet surprisingly it is the mythology that is most repeated, often as fact in lore discoveries and profiles such as these, sadly with no context around its origins, its status as a retcon, and the alternatives that I have just shared. Now, that said, it is my preferred origin theory, not just because it now best aligns with the retconned timeline, but isolated from the havoc it brought to the timeline and other impacts, I genuinely like the story and the added depth it brings to the ancient eras that often get overlooked. So while I obviously have no issue with this being your canon or even the canon, I do think a proper disclaimer, doing my best to provide all of the context surrounding its status as a 100% retcon, is valid and, in my opinion, should be a minimum expectation when presenting lore or anything historical in the Dungeons & Dragons universe. I mean, if you're a 3rd edition player, this is about as foreign as it gets, so yeah, I think it's important to make you aware. Okay, with that out of the way, this mythology, as I mentioned, starts with the 4th edition and is referenced on page 41 of the sourcebook Campaign Guide to the Forgotten Realms, the 4th edition version. And it's here that we learn the Batraki, the ancient and once dominant amphibious creator race we profiled in Volume 2, present what is today considered to be the most widely accepted of the Tearfall origins, although this theory as well is not without issue, which I'll get into shortly. Often recounted in the oral traditions preserved by the Batraki descendants and in fragmented text, this origin story centers around the ancient mass ritual known as the Great Summoning. This critical moment in Batraki history, around negative 31,500 DR, was precipitated by conflict with the Jotunbrud, an ancestor race of titans and the progenitors of the giants of today. The Batraki, both confident and seeking further dominion upon Abir Torel, engaged the Titans of Astoria in a long, protracted war. The pivotal moment arose approximately 500 years later, in or around negative 31,000 DR, as the war between these two formidable powers aged into the centuries. The Batraki leader at this time was named Jokodian, known as the High One, and this fateful event began to take shape after he was killed in a battle with a Titan Thane named Omo. In the wake of this defeat, the Jotunbrud of Astoria went on the offensive, resulting in a dramatic shift in the tides of war, which saw the Batraki on the verge of defeat, the collapse of their empire imminent. Now, you might recall from our Volume 1 discussions that at the end of the Dawn War between the gods and the primordial powers, the primordials were betrayed at the hands of one of their own, a primordial named Ubteao the Deceiver. In defeat, many of the primordials of the Dawn War that were not killed were imprisoned. Now facing a final defeat to the Jotunbrut and desperate to save their falling kingdom, the Batraki powers thought it wise to enact a grand ritual summoning in order to release those imprisoned primordials, all done in the false hope that they might turn the tides of war against the giants of Astoria. As you will learn in Chapter 6, this great summoning will be tied to two others, helping to explain this entire lore retcon. Now, with the benefit of historical insight, we can look upon this fateful summoning as the mother of ancient well-duh moments, as the primordials were only concerned with revenge upon the gods, having no concern with and zero impact on the Titans or their ongoing war with the Batraki. And while this account tells us the gods were quick to react in opposing their ancient foes, one primordial in particular would be the lament of the Batraki and change the course of Aearee Torel's future. It was during this second war with the primordials that one released primordial named Asgaroth the World Shaper, yes, the very one we covered in the dragon creation myth, also known as Io, was intent on destroying a world he or she could not claim as their own. To this destructive end, Asgaroth, showing immense godlike powers, grabbed an orbiting object from the very cosmos. The accounts identifying this orbiting object from the astral sea actually vary pretty greatly depending upon your source. Some define this celestial body as an ice moon. Others clearly call it a large comet. And many scholars of Candlekeep have written it was in fact an asteroid cluster called the Tears of Selûne. Interestingly, some sages in the It Was an Ice Moon camp have also come to name this moon Zatha, who you might remember from our Chapter 4 story was, according to Draconic beliefs, an actual god of creation. Another perfect example of religious and cultural interpretation, not so dissimilar from how ancient Greece called the planet Jupiter Zeus, or the fact that in our own modern times, humans have adopted the Roman pantheon names for our planets. But this conflicting narrative matters little. In this account of the lore, it was a planet-killing-sized object, and it was hurled down upon the world by Asgaroth, an act that threatened life, once again, upon Aearee Torel. Now the lore gets a little gray on what happened next. We know that according to this mythology, Ao stepped in, at some point, sundering the planet to create two distinct worlds. I mean, it's right there in the text. Quote, "Yet before the world was torn completely asunder, the Hidden One intervened." End quote. The key words there being completely asunder. Because clearly there was still some level of planet-wide destruction. How else would the planet be so wrecked? And some savvy watchers out there have certainly already received an answer in that 4e text. I can hear you typing right now. Rich, it says right there, quote, "The gods quickly moved against their ancient foes, resulting in terrible earthquakes, fires, and windstorms that swept across the planet." Okay, fair enough, but that does not explain how the four inner seas became one. You know, like what would happen if you plunged a moon-sized object into the center of four seas. They'd probably merge. So, questions yet remain. And I did do my homework on this one. I've seen theories that claim the Sea of Fallen Stars was not formed at all, and the splitting of the world simply changed the landscape and cartography. But that's a little too hand-wavy in my book. So, was this intervention from Lord Ao only able to limit the damage of the impact of the Tearfall? Given the god of creation's known powers, this is highly unlikely. But perhaps Lord Ao was preoccupied, with the war, and this delay in action resulted in the reduced but still significant impact. Plausible, I'd say even likely. Maybe Lord Ao felt the Batraki deserved their fate for their actions in releasing the primordials in the first place. Pure speculation on my part, as I think the more mundane truth, at least at my table, is that the Tearfall struck the inner seas, causing the Sea of Fallen Stars, which now becomes a very appropriate name for the large body of water. Lord Ao, using his godlike powers, ensured that what would have been a life-erasing impact did not destroy the planet, but the resulting drastic climate changes took their toll on the remaining Batraki, wiping out what remained of their civilization and perhaps driving any survivors back to the sea. So, suffice to say that Lord Ao, intent on finding an everlasting peace with the primordials, split the singular planet of Aearee Torel in twain, creating two near-identical but distinct planets, and also creating a great device with which Wizards of the Coast could remove lands and destroy civilizations, but that's a rant for another time. Two planets, Aearee, the new home of the primordials, placed into its own pocket dimension, and Toril, your home should you reside anywhere in the Forgotten Realms. As part of this actual First Sundering that's totally not called the First Sundering, Lord Ao also creates the fabled Tablets of Fate, which perhaps have a few tales of their own to tell sometime. Following in the wake of the Tearfall, as if there was not already enough chaos going on in this time period, one might posit the Tearfall was not even the most significant of the many significant events during this time, that perhaps, depending upon your chosen mythology or historical doctrine, that infamous honor might have to be given to Lord Ao's splitting of the planet of Aearee Torel into two separate worlds. This event is known only recently by today's scholars as the Sundering, which can be very confusing in the context of two other Sunderings in the historic timeline taking place thousands of years after these days of thunder. But they are connected. Now, sort of. It would be impossible, or at least very incomplete, to go any further into Lord Ao's Sundering of Aearee Torel without mentioning just some of the changes and retcons that 4th edition brought, aka the Spellplague. And while 5th edition made an admirable attempt to erase many of the sins of 4th edition, when it comes to the historical canon of the world, specific to historical events and the altering of timelines, that's mostly a one-way street. If you're confused, you're not alone. In fact, I will likely create an entire volume on the Spellplague and the 4E retcons at some point, but for today, in order to avoid a massive rabbit hole of Spellplague changes that's just calling my name, we're going to limit our discussion very narrowly to those retcons that 5e could not reverse and that are specific to the Tearfall and the Sundering of the planet. I struggled to write a concise summary many times over, one that would remain targeted only to the Tearfall and the Sundering. I kept writing paragraphs of detailed explanations that are far better suited for its own volume on the Spellplague and 4th edition. And then I stepped away and attempted to explain it to a non-tabletop gamer friend of mine in a casual conversation. You know, the explain it like I'm 5 method. And it worked. So the summary, the TLDR if you will, is the god of creation, Wizards of the Coast, Lord Ao, broke these artifacts called the Tablets of Fate that had no power but also had lots of power, and in doing so created all of these changes upon the world. You know, the ones that came with 4th edition, the Spellplague. Lord Ao then looked upon those changes and soon realized he didn't like them. And more importantly, his consumers, people, his followers, also hated these changes. So much so that Lord Ao rewrote the tablets, thus ending 4E and bringing the world back to its 3.5 lore, mostly. Okay. All kidding aside, because it is one of the more confusing aspects of the lore, and in my opinion, probably the worst self-inflicted wound by Wizards. Well, at least in-game, it's hard to top some of their out-of-game blunders as of late. 4E fractured a lot of the timeline and lore of the realms, and hats off to the 5e designers making a valiant, if not rousing, success in an attempt to remove the worst parts of 4E. We can most certainly go deep into the weeds if you want, but we'll save that for a dedicated volume if that's something you'd like to see. But I would like to take a crack at providing some clarity to this truly confusing facet of the lore. And I mean this sincerely. So many players, GMs, and world builders are confused by this history. I see the questions routinely across various forums, Reddit posts, and for good reason. It's kind of a mess. So I think the best way to accomplish this would be to connect the retcon dots of the first Sundering, the second Sundering, the Tearfall, and the splitting of Aearee Torel. And no, that's not a mistake. What the lore calls the first Sundering is in fact a separate event from the splitting of the planet, and did indeed happen after the actual first sundering of the planet by 14,000 years, in fact. Yeah, I know, but give me a minute. I think, at least hope, I can clear this up. Mostly. I would also add here that some scholars join the Tearfall and the sundering or splitting of the planet as one event. It's semantics. I think they are separate for the reasons I've outlined previously, but they are events so intimately close, it would be pedantic to argue the point. Okay, the Tearfall in or around negative 31,000 DR marked disaster to the planet, and Lord Aeo's first act of separation on the planet into two distinct worlds, Aearee and Torel, which up until that point had been one unified world known as Aearee Torel. And just for clarity, prior to the launch of 4th edition, the planet was always called Toril, literally since 1967 when Ed Greenwood first created it. The Aearee in Aearee Torel is a 4E invention, plot device, if you will. While this original splitting event during the wake of the Tearfall is sometimes referred to as the first sundering, because it makes sense, it's not. The canonical first sundering took place almost 14,000 years later, in negative 17,600 Dale reckoning, existing prior to 4th edition as the Elven Sundering, the historical event known for the elven creation of the Isle of Evermeet through a high magic ritual. We will learn when 4E launches that this Elven Sundering from negative 17,600 DR, now the first Sundering, had new and far-reaching detrimental effects that rippled not only forward in time, but backwards as well, devastating the land, but also creating two additional Sunderings, and I bet you can guess at least one of them. The first was indeed the Tearfall of negative 31,000 DR, precipitated by another powerful and dangerous mass ritual magic spell, eerily similar to the ritual the elves used to create the Isle of Evermeet, this time with the Batraki, the Great Summoning, to release and call forth the imprisoned primordials. Moving forward nearly 16,000 years, first we have the Time of Troubles in 1358 DR, where the Tablets of Fate are first stolen by Bane and Merkel in hopes of gaining Lord Aeo's power, and then shattered by Lord Aeo himself, followed by his banishment of the gods to walk among the mortals. We learn in this era that while the Tablets of Fate did not have the powers in the way Bane and Merkel had hoped, they were certainly imbued with cosmic powers of creation, because we learn in the 4E lore that the tablets were in fact the twin pillars of holding, keeping the worlds of Aearee and Torel apart. And with their destruction by Lord Aeo during the Time of Troubles, the worlds were slowly merging back together. A mere 37 years later, we find ourselves at the launch of 4th edition, Dale Reckoning 1385, with the Spellplague, where the rabbit hole goes deep, yet I resist. In response to all the calamities of the Spellplague, as we move into 5E around 1485 DR, Lord Aeo then recreates the Tablets of Fate, causing Aearee and Torel to separate once again into two distinct worlds. This second splitting event is known as the Second Sundering. Now, if you got all that first pass, gold star, you're likely way smarter than I. But at its absolute and most basic, if you retain nothing else from this chapter, just remember that the first Sundering, the retconned lore involving the creation of Evermeet, which rippled across time and space to create the concept of Aearee, is the introduction of 4th edition. And the second Sundering, to merge the worlds back and return the retconned lands to Toril, marks 5th edition and an attempt to unwind the sins of 4E. Yes, it's a mess, and I'm actually pretty proud of myself for staying out of the rabbit holes, because to me, this 4E retcon probably doesn't make my top 10 list of atrocities 4E did to the lore. What they did to the planes and the Nine Hells in particular, the entire civilizations they just removed because they were not convenient, egregious at best, and WTF mind-numbingly stupid at worst. You let me know if you want a volume on that nightmare. Gods murdered, the weave fails, planes shattered, yeah, good times. But hopefully I've given you a little clarity and certainly plenty of lore options for the sundering of Aearee Torel and the Tearfall. We would not be able to properly close out the Days of Thunder if we did not cover the third of the three primary creator races to leave their mark upon this age. The Aearee, avian heralds of a distant past, soared through the skies of ancient Faerun on the heels of the subsiding dramatic changes of the Tearfall, in or around circa -31,000 DR. But any historical discussion of the Aearee must begin with the deity from which they are so closely aligned. Unlike the Saruk world serpent deity, whose origins were far more obscure and most likely existed as but an amalgamation of many different gods, most sages and scholars agree that the Aearee primarily worshipped a single deity, and her name was Akkadi. To properly define the Aearee and their creation god, one must delve into Akkadi's nature, influence, and her particular disposition, as well as the practices and beliefs of her followers. If you are interested in the full lore of this goddess of air, I should have a volume up that is completely dedicated to this nomadic goddess within a week or so of this volume going live. I was actually working on them in parallel. I will add a link in the show notes when it's available. Akkadi went by many names: the goddess of the sky, the queen of air, mistress of the winds, lady of the sky, and mostly forgotten, she was also referred to as Talos and Lord of Storms by those of the Endless Wastes, known as the Hordelands, who, interestingly, are the only sect of her followers known to draw no distinction to her gender, often using both male and female titles such as Lord and Lady interchangeably. But regardless of the name or title used, in the pantheon of the Forgotten Realms, Akkadi sits as the embodiment of the element of air, the whispering wind and the blinding gale, her form known to change from season to season, her kiss upon the mortal realm ranging from soft and moist to cold and biting. And it is from this mythological dogma that the Aearee came to be, birthed from the divine breath of Akkadi herself. The Lady of Air bestowed upon them not just the gifts of flight and agility, but also imbued the avian creator race with an intrinsic connection to the element of air and the insatiable urge to explore. In these earliest days, this sacred bond granted the Aearee dominion over the skies and the creatures that roamed it. Akkadi's essence flowed through the Aearee, and until the time of dragons, this divine ability bestowed upon the Aearee granted them near celestial but fleeting status among the creatures of the realm. The Aearee first emerged on a large island nestled in the Silver Sea, known as the Aearee Enclaves. This mountainous island provided the perfect isolated and perched sanctuary for the avian race to develop their society and their culture. The Aearee spent their early years innovating feats of aerial architecture, constructing elaborate cliffside nests and rookeries situated precariously upon the isle's high peaks and suspended precipitously along its sheer cliffs. Aearee society consisted of three social castes: the Claw as the ruling class, the Fang as the warrior class, and the Wing, consisting of workers and servants. The Aearee's isolation fostered a peaceful society, initially focused inward. With few external aerial threats or competition over resources, they had no need for conquest or expansion off their island home. The Aearee were content to fly freely through the open skies of the island, in perfect alignment with Akkadi's divine mandate to freely soar the skies in exploration. But that would change around the turn of the new millennia. When the landscape of Faerun was radically altered by the Tearfall we covered earlier, this cataclysmic event shattered the ancient supercontinent of Meroboros. In the chaos that followed, as the Saruk and Batraki empires had collapsed, some Aearee saw an opportunity to expand their influence across Faerun. This split would result in two major Aearee factions emerging during this post-Tearfall time of expansion. The Aearee Kokra were a largely neutral people, preferring diplomacy over military force. From their great Aearee Viaku, situated atop the towering Mount Havraquar and ruled by the wise Aearee Kroka, they built a peaceful empire, stretching from the Shining Sea to the northern spine of the world and then westward into Mastika. By forging alliances with other races like the Kuatl, the Aearee Kokra constructed an empire secured through friendship and diplomacy rather than fear. In contrast, the Aearee Kinku were ruthless conquerors who claimed their lands by force. They named their domain Shara, their breathtaking capital, constructed within the frosted Orzron Mountains, located south of the Spine of the World. Under the reign of their leader Quar, the Aearee Kinku aggressively expanded from eastern Faerun north into Vasa, using conflict, intimidation, and the subjugation of other races to implement their vision of expansion and order across the land. The Aearee Kinku, it seemed like the Saruk and Batrachi of the past, would take no lessons from those that tread before them. A third Grand Aerie in Fucree existed as a stronghold of the northern Aearee Siren within the snow-capped Star Mounts, a towering range of mountainous peaks located in the center of the high forest, guided by their venerable leader, Siren. Despite their philosophical differences, both Aearee factions sought to cement control through magical research and engineering. The Kokra focused their efforts on augmenting the inherent abilities of their domesticated landworm servants. After generations of selective breeding and alchemical engineering, they created the first generation of winged worms, known today as wyverns. These flying reptilian beasts provided the Kokra with an aerial cavalry that enabled rapid military defensive strikes across their empire. The Aearee Kinku took a more unorthodox approach, attempting to magically splice lamasus with manticores to produce controllable flying soldiers. However, the manticore hybrids proved too fierce and chaotic, forcing the Kinku to abandon the experiment and release the creatures into the wilds. Both factions continued to advance the now millennia-old traditions of the Beit Teth from the writings of the Saruk and Batrachi empires. Bolstered by their wyvern air force, the Aearee empires continued expanding over the next century. Around negative 30,800 DR, the wyverns played a pivotal role in defeating an invasion force of over 500 cloud giants protecting the Aearee northern border. The Aearee ascendancy reached its peak in approximately negative 30,700 DR. Yet this apex of construction and creativity soon gave way to a period of strife and decline, the Aearee seemingly abandoning the more carefree and nomadic dogma of their creator Akkadi. Troubling signs soon began to appear that the Aearee would face grave threats to their dominance. Around negative 30,600 DR, during an expansionist campaign, aerial squadrons and elite warriors from Vaiku suffered devastating losses in a violent confrontation with the mystical Lamasu over territorial disputes, killing the Kokra Emperor and decimating their forces. With losses estimated to exceed 1,000, this would mark the beginning of the once dominant empire's rapid decline. However, the most devastating time for the Aearee came circa negative 30,400 DR, as tensions erupted into a bloody conflict as the Kinku violently clashed with the Gnolls of Urganosh, a particular nation of Gnolls that were loyal worshippers to the demon lord Yenogu. These Yenogu shaman called upon the vile Mirash, summoning these evil, winged spirits with the head of a jackal and well known for spreading contagions. The Mirash cursed Aearee crops with blight and unleashed the devastating wasting plague upon the Kinku. The demonic plague's debilitating effects proved costly. Those afflicted soon lost their wings, and those that were not killed by disease or battle found themselves driven into exile as the war was lost. As their crops withered and the plague claimed more and more victims, the once prosperous Aearee civilization was utterly decimated. In desperation, some afflicted Aearee that survived even turned to the god Pazrael and his sinister clergy, beginning the empire's slide into corruption and darkness. Corrupted, evil, decimated, the last vestiges of the Aearee nation still had the advantage of flight over most other species. Perhaps a restoration of their empire was possible. And then came the time of dragons. And that concludes Volume 3 in our grand history of these Forgotten Realms, but we're only just warming up, as next in Volume 4 we enter the Time of Dragons, better known as the Dawn Age, covering the next 6,000 years of fantastic history and lore. There we will not only uncover the origins and rise to dominance of the dragons, but the origins of Bahamut and Tiamat, the first dragon rider, the 1,000-year war between the giants and dragons, an opening of planar gates from the Fae. All that and more. I hope you will join me then, and that you were entertained and/or learned something new today. If you'd like to support the channel, please check out the links below, and if you think I earned it, please like and subscribe. Thanks for listening, and until next time, remember, the only limitation at your table is your imagination.